Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk to an author who's fast becoming a phenomenon, I think, and who has written a book that I suppose can be called an advice book, but it's so much more, it's not even funny. So let's get to the title. The title of this book is Tiny, Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar. The author, Cheryl Strayed, is with us today, and the book is published by Vintage. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
This is really a very different book. I despise advice books. I avoid them. And here it was, somewhere on the desk at home, and I picked it up, and I said, Holy Toledo, this is... Well, I didn't say Holy Toledo. I said something worse. But this is really radically different. This book comes from a program that runs online still, right?
That's right, a website called therumpus.net.
Rumpus.net. And the program on rumpus.net that you write is called Dear Sugar.
Correct.
A pseudonym to which you have only recently confessed.
Right.
Did you actually do it on Valentine's Day?
I did. I thought, if my name is Sugar, I might as well reveal my identity on the sweetest holiday around, Valentine's Day.
Oh, how wonderful.
And I live in Portland, Oregon, but I flew to San Francisco for that coming out party. I figure if you're going to come out, San Francisco is a good place to do it.
This is it.
That's right.
Any closet you're coming out from, fine. Do it in,
That's right.
Do it in San Francisco.
And also the Rumpus is based here in San Francisco. So
that's right, yeah.
It's sort of Sugar's home.
Now, there was a predecessor, Sugar, a man, actually.
Mm-hmm.
What was his name?
The writer Steve Almond originated the column. He began writing it in 2009, early 2009. And in March 2010, I got this email. He was a friend of mine, and he said, I've been writing this advice column on the Rumpus. It doesn't pay anything. I write it anonymously. I'm not that interested in doing it. Would you like to do it? And, it's really par for my course that I would take on a job that paid nothing and had really nothing to recommend it. But
what an invitation.
Exactly. What an invitation. But it's something about it sparked my interest because like you, I had no particular affinity for advice columns. I wasn't, I was only an occasional reader. If I came across something, I'd read it.
Yeah.
But I certainly didn't think of it as a literary form. And I'm a literary writer, so why would I write an advice column? And the reason is that something inside of me blossomed, and I thought, this sounds interesting. People writing to me, telling me their secrets, their struggles, their sorrows, and I get to tell them what I think about it. And really, that is what a writer does. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we delve into what it means to be human, and I thought I would try to do that in the course of giving advice.
The other thing that is different, as I read the book, from all other advice columns that I know anything about, is that you freely, willingly put your own story, your own life, into their problems as a way of illuminating, as a way of getting a foothold on what to say, what to do in a given situation. That's very different, it seems to me.
Yes, and when I did it, it was one part instinctual. I knew that really, as a person, that people's stories had been what had been my deepest consolation. When I had problems, I turned to stories and poems and novels to really offer me some light. And so I thought, well, of course, this is what I have to offer. I can tell stories. I can tell stories about my life, my own struggles. And I was also a little hesitant to do that because I didn't want people to think that what I was doing was using their problem just as a springboard, an excuse to tell my story. I was truly trying to, I try to tell my stories, as you say, to help illuminate those letter writers' problems.
No, and you in a very, forgive the expression, literary manner, integrate your story with the content that they've presented in their letters, and it's very smooth, and it's like, wait, this is the way it should be done.
Thank you so much.
I think it really, really works.
Thank you.
But,
it is, and earlier at the outset of the program, you said, you started to read this book and it wasn't what you expected.
Yeah.
You saw that word advice on the cover, and that's really been the history of the Dear Sugar column. I'm always saying, well, just read it, because it's not like any advice column you've probably read before. And that's how Sugar gained in popularity, is people would online go on the Rumpus and read the column and post it on their Twitter feed or their Facebook page and say, okay, I don't normally read advice, but read this. And that's what this collection is for people who don't normally read advice, but.
As Mr. Allen points out in the introduction, he first of all talks about one of the instances, one of the things in your life that you reveal your relationship with your grandfather, which is violating you sexually,
right?
And you tell about that in answering somebody's question. And Armand says it was an absolutely unprecedented moment. Advice columnists, after all, adhere to an unspoken code: focus on the letter writer, dispense the necessary bromides, make it all seem bearable. Disclosing your own sexual assault is not part of the code. So that's where it puts us. That's you as Dear Sugar. We're going to find out more about this Dear Sugar when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Tiny, beautiful things. Advice on love and life from Dear Sugar by Cheryl Strayed, published by Vintage Books. That's what we're talking about today. And a rather nice magazine by the name of New Republic has had some good things to say about this book, which I think we should share. Charming, it says, idiosyncratic, luminous. All of those are just wonderful, right? And then he or she says profane. Okay, Sugar is the ultimate advice columnist for the Internet age. And it's going to go on for a long time, so you're going to be the ultimate for a long time. And she, that's you, she shines out amid the sea of fakeness. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's really nice. There is a lot of fakery out there. I can remember every once in a while somebody in the advice business has a fall in their personal life, a divorce, they were violent or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's such a shock to see it in the papers, because they have presented themselves for all the years of their column as the infallible, omnipotent source of advice and good living. Mm-hmm. And that ain't you.
No,
that you be something else. You be something much more real.
Right. I've never positioned myself as superior or someone who knew all the answers or who didn't have to struggle myself. I think that that's a really key piece of the Dear Sugar column and what I'm interested in as an artist too. Being honest about oneself and as open and vulnerable on the page as possible. And, when I do that, so often I'm giving advice and saying, look, I've been there too. I understand that dark side. I understand that struggle. I understand doing things you regret doing.
Maybe that's the key to it. Maybe when, if your self-identity is and should be a literary writer, and you're not giving that up when you go into this column, whereas a lot of other people are, forgive the expression, just writers, and wouldn't think of being literary or think of the boundaries created by those words in giving advice in a column like this.
Right. When I took over the column, what I knew for sure is I was going to give it everything I had. I was going to bring all of my whatever I had to offer as a writer to bear on this column. And I was going to take it as seriously as I've taken writing my other two books, a novel and a memoir. And it wasn't going to be lesser writing because of the form. Mm-hmm. And so the form had to rise to my endeavor. And I wasn't sure I wouldn't fail at it. Okay. Honestly.
No, true.
You know, I really thought, well, maybe I can't do this. Maybe I'm going to make a fool of myself.
Well, it's just really possible. As
absolutely.
One of the reviewers says, you're trying to stand this form on its head. And that's dangerous.
It is.
You can get in trouble.
You can. People could have just laughed and shaken their heads, you know, at my columns.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, why it was so interesting to me from the beginning, is it was an experiment. You know, I didn't know how it would turn out.
Somewhere else in the material, or maybe it's something that you said, there's a discussion about doing advice or writing advice as though one were writing an essay. Mm-hmm. And that's very clear in the book. And I just like to cite one of them, and it's not long. This is an essay on what's love. Mm-hmm. It is not so incomprehensible as you pretend, you say to the inquirer. Love is the feeling we have for those we care deeply about and hold in high regard. It can be light as the hug we can give a friend, or heavy as the sacrifices we make for our children. It can be romantic, platonic, familial, fleeting, everlasting, conditional, unconditional, imbued with sorrow, stoked by sex, sullied by abuse, amplified by kindness, twisted by betrayal, deepened by time, darkened by difficulty, leavened by generosity, nourished by humor, and loaded with promises and commitments that we may or may not want to keep. That's totally complete and totally realistic, which you rarely see. People start talking about love, they get carried away.
That's right.
Far away. And you don't. And then you add, toward the end of the book, you cannot convince people to love you. Wow. This is an absolute rule. No one will ever give you love because you want him or her to give it. Real love moves freely in both directions. Don't waste your time on anything else. That's worth the price of the book right there, I think.
Really, I mean, think of all the people where really that's the struggle of their life. They can't come to terms with, you know, that mother who never loved them the right way. Or that father who abandoned them, or the lover who ultimately left. Why? And that question is always, well, why can't I get that person to love me?
Yeah, why not?
And as we know, life teaches us we can't convince people to love us. That's truly an absolute rule.
You know what's horrible about that is that trying to get people to love you, it seems to be something that every one of us does in the teenage.
Right.
And unfortunately, many of us never stop trying it.
That's right. We never move beyond that sort of childlike longing, and see that really that love is given freely. It really is. Those relationships that are worth investing in are with people who are going to love you.
Your advice in this book comes in long and short bursts. The one about love we might consider long, or part of a long one. Mm-hmm. And there's another piece of advice that you say is the best advice you give to people in their 20s. Quote, buy 10 books of poetry and read them each 5 times. Now, why are you wanting to say that for advice?
Why? Because I think that...
Because you're a writer and you want to sell books.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are poets. I think we need to support poets. But honestly, there are 2 reasons why. One is that is something I did really in my youth, and I still do it, but especially in my 20s. I would read poetry, and I would read it over and over again. And it put me in a place that was contemplative, reflective, and also outward. I'm reading someone else's words, someone else's imaginings. Mm-hmm. And I think that it really brought me both deeper into myself and outside of myself. And so I think it can be, so often, what are we doing now? We're checking email, we're on Facebook, we're tweeting and all of this stuff.
Right.
And I think reaching for something that is more contemplative and internal can be a very powerfully informative and healing thing to do.
Yeah, we're too busy being overwhelmed with information.
Right.
And what you're suggesting is poetry is a good way to stop that or get out of it.
It is.
And go someplace else.
That's right. And so many people have said, okay, now which 10 books? And the answer to that is the 10 that you're attracted to. Go to a bookstore and amble down that poetry aisle and see what captures your interest.
Assuming you can find a bookstore with a poetry aisle.
That's right. As I said that, I honestly thought the same thing. I'm just sad to tell you.
One of the most important aspects of Tiny Beautiful Things is the author's willingness to share her life. That's what we've been talking about. A great illustration of this when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
We are having a beautiful time today talking about a book with beautiful in the title, Tiny Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar, who's actually Cheryl Strayed. She just, came out on Valentine's Day. I'm very, very happy for that, or we'd have to be sitting here saying sugar this and sugar that. The publisher of this great book is Vintage Books. Sasha Frere Jones from The New Yorker says about it, in part, Sugar doesn't coddle her readers. I agree with that. She believes them and hears the stories inside the story they think they want to tell. And I think you do that in a lot of the cases. She manages astonishing levels of empathy without dissolving into sentiment and sees problems before the reader can. Sugar doesn't promise to make anyone feel good, only that she understands a question well enough to answer it. Modest but true goal as far as someone giving advice. And you don't know whether they're going to follow it. And just, try to understand the problem and move on.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I hear from about half the reader, the letter writers.
Yeah, I was astonished by that statistic.
Yeah. Does that seem low or high to you?
That seems very high to me.
Does it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, about half of them write to me afterwards and say they talk about the advice I gave them and what happened after that. It's been a really interesting experience to see that.
One of the great pleasures of this book is that it's written well. Can you demonstrate that for us, please? In an interesting piece that I've chosen for you, which is what not to do.
What not to do?
Yeah.
Don't do what you know on a gut level to be the wrong thing to do. Don't stay when you know you should go, or go when you know you should stay. Don't fight when you should hold steady, or hold steady when you should fight. Don't focus on the short-term fun instead of the long-term fallout. Don't surrender all your joy for an idea you used to have about yourself that isn't true anymore. Don't seek joy at all costs. I know it's hard to know what to do when you have a conflicting set of emotions and desires, but it's not as hard as we pretend it is. Saying it's hard is ultimately a justification to do whatever seems like the easiest thing to do. Have the affair, stay at that horrible job, end a friendship over a slight, keep loving someone who treats you terribly. I don't think there's a single dumbass thing I've done in my adult life that I didn't know was a dumbass thing to do while I was doing it, even when I justified it to myself, as I did every damn time. The truest part of me knew I was doing the wrong thing. Always. As the years pass, I'm learning how to better trust my gut and not do the wrong thing, but every so often I get a harsh reminder that I've still got work to do.
As we all have.
That's right.
As we all have. One of the most moving moments for me in the book, at least the one that I read, involves you and Mr. Sugar, mm-hmm. and a conversation that you're having in a restaurant. You remember a younger version of yourself as you pondered this letter, and recall that at a time 15 years ago when you were sitting in a cafe with Mr. Sugar. We'd only been lovers for a month, but we were already in deep, thick, in the thrall of the you tell me everything and I'll tell you everything because I love you so madly stage of the relationship. And on this particular afternoon, I was telling him the harrowing tale of how I had gotten pregnant by a heroin addict the year before and how I felt so angry, blah, blah, blah. I sliced my arm with a knife, even though I'd never done that before. And when I got to the part about cutting myself, Mr. Sugar stopped me, and he said, "Don't get me wrong. I want to hear everything about your life, but I want you to know that you don't need to tell me this to get me to love you. You don't have to be broken for me."
You know, it's interesting you point to that as a place in the book where you were moved, because it was really an incredibly moving moment in my own life, because it was this moment when I realized that what I had been doing in some ways was making myself a victim to get men to love me. That part of my cycle was men could only love me if they could see my weakness, or that they could see that I needed them to protect me or give me something. And the man I call Mr. Sugar in the book, who is my husband, Brian
Sure.
Lindstrom, looked me square in the eye, and he knew that he knew me. And for him to say to me, "You don't have to be broken to me," it was truly this transformative moment in my life. And I would say, in many ways, it's what allowed us, in part, to still be together today, because I grew up in that moment. And maybe so did he. You know, maybe part of his thing had been that he'd been falling in love with women who were broken for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went to this new place as equals.
Yeah, and it's a place where neither person in the relationship has to play the victim.
Right. Or the savior.
Either one, in order to get the love or be appreciated.
That's right. That's right.
What a great place. What a great place.
Thank you.
One of the most unusual presentations in here, which we're not really going to be able to get into, is one called The Obliterated Place, where somebody sends in a 22-point letter, and you respond with 28?
Mm-hmm.
29.
29. It's a list.
29.
Both letters are lists, yes.
It's another great part of the book. What book? Tiny Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar by Cheryl Strayed, published by Vintage Books. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.